Welcome back! Today we're trying Ark Survival Ascended. We are going to try, like always, find out the real minimum requirement. So what they propose is the AMD Ryzen 5 2600X or the Intel Core i7 6800K, 16GB of RAM, AMD Radeon RX 5600 XT or the NVIDIA 1080, and require an SSD. We're not going to touch the SSD right now, we're going to find out the CPU and the GPU. I'm Dunk, let's game on! To start, I decided to go to the AMD side, and instead of the Ryzen 5 2600, I went to the Ryzen 5 1600, and instead of the 1080, I went with my trusty 980 Ti. With all setting at low, 720p, my FPS was 42. It's highly playable. Low resolution, but highly playable. This game balance CPU-GPU is heavily towards the GPU. Then remove the 1600 to put the Ryzen 5 1500X, which will be a 4-core 8-thread instead of a 6-core 12-thread. But again, we barely use the CPU. The usage is peak at 60%, while the GPU is peg at 99-100% at 720p. Normally the CPU is cranked up or peg at the 720p, and we're still averaging a 42 FPS. Then I switched to the Intel side, but instead of the i7 6800K, I was testing the i5 6500. So we passed from 6-core 12-thread to 4-core 4-thread. I was averaging a nice 35 FPS, but the stuttering, it was awful, having dropped to the single-digit FPS often, and for a long period. That was really unplayable, to the point that the game decided to just freeze. For some reason, the CPU was pegged at 99% quite often. Not sure if it's related to the number of core. Then I decided to try something else, go older but with more core, so I dropped to the i7 3770, which is a 4-core 8-thread. And beside the stutter when you start the game for the first time, while it loads everything, afterward the game was running perfectly, same as the other CPU at 42 FPS. And the CPU was not peg, so this game is not CPU dependent, but apparently it's a core thread dependent. More you have, smoother it will be. Then I decided to test my theory, and I went with the i5 2500, another 4-core 4-thread CPU. And surprisingly enough, I get the same stutter as the i5 6500, a bit more stable, but not playable either. I get in the high 30 FPS average, but the stutter make the game drop the FPS in the single digit. Again, it really seems the number of core is related to the stability of the game. I wonder if the game stability, with all the people complaining on the Steam community, is related with the number of core the people are using for their rig, because multiple people complain about the game crashing. But do they have a 4-core 4-thread CPU? I decided to do another test. What about the latest generation of Intel? I mean the LGA 1700, and the lowest CPU I have for that platform is the i3 12100F, which is a 4-core 8-thread like the i7 3770. And surprisingly enough, its performance are quite similar to the i7 3770. The GPU is still peg, but the CPU is in the high 40-50% usage. The smoothness is similar, and it's less smooth than the Ryzen 5 1500 or 1600. Really, the number of core make a big difference for this game, even if it's not CPU intensive, it's core intensive. And with that 12th gen i3, let's try the GTX 970, dropping out the 980 Ti. So we now have 4GB of VRAM instead of 6GB VRAM. And it is horrible. We're averaging an FPS of 21. This is not playable. Plus the stutter. Maybe the GTX 1060 6GB or the RX 580 8GB can fare better than this, but I don't have. I cannot try. To finish this up, and since I have my 12th gen i3 out, I've tried the Ark A770 LE with resizable on the latest driver. I was able to play at 1080p low to reach a 30 FPS. That's our winner for the 1080p. I was expecting better from that GPU, but I guess peg at 100%, that's the best it can do for that game. So our winner for the 720p low 30 FPS-ish will be any CPU 4-core 8-thread with the GTX 980 Ti, or maybe any other 6GB card. And if you're a 1080p person, then any 4-core 8-thread that support resizable bar with the A770. Maybe other card, but I don't have all the card. Thanks to have come watching, see you on the next one, and subscribe.